We are often told that psychological endurance is a solitary pursuit. The cultural ideal is the lone wolf, the stoic individual who encounters extreme adversity, tightens their jaw, and simply toughs it out. This individualistic mandate overlaps with a pervasive cultural requirement for good vibes only. Clinically, this is toxic positivity, the insistence on a happy exterior that leaves no room for the actual processing of grief. But ignoring psychological friction doesn't make it disappear. It forces the nervous system to absorb the blow. Biologists refer to this as the allostatic load, the physical wear and tear that accumulates when your brain and body are forced into a state of chronic, unacknowledged stress. When we attempt to comfort ourselves by plastering on a fake smile, we are relying on a maladaptive coping mechanism. It provides a fleeting moment of relief, but over time, it breeds complex guilt and anxiety. The suppressed emotions don't vanish, they magnify. For marginalized communities dealing with systemic or intergenerational trauma, this forced optimism is even more damaging. It acts as a form of emotional imperialism, imposing a rigid expectation of cheerfulness that completely ignores the deep-seated reality of historical pain. The impenetrable armor society asks us to wear does not actually protect us. It isolates the individual and suffocates the nervous system. To actually survive severe hardship, we have to dismantle this idea of what it means to be strong. To see how human beings regulate their minds under pressure, we can look at classical Stoicism. This ancient philosophy wasn't about eradicating human emotion. It was a highly practical operating system for managing how we interpret reality. Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius practiced a specific technique called cognitive stripping. When faced with the terrifying pressures of warfare or absolute rule, he would break down objects into their most basic physical descriptions to neutralize the anxiety attached to them. The central mechanism making this work is the dichotomy of control. This is the rigorous categorization of life into two buckets: elements within your control, like thoughts and actions, and elements you cannot control, like the weather. This exact method of challenging subjective impressions forms the foundational architecture of modern evidence-based psychotherapy. Pioneering clinical psychologists like Albert Ellis explicitly cited ancient Stoic philosophy when developing therapies to help patients identify and systematically dismantle negative automatic thoughts. True cognitive discipline is the ability to ruthlessly organize the chaos around you. It protects your executive function and keeps your mind stable, even when the environment is unpredictable. Yet, even the most disciplined logic has limits. Thinking through a crisis only works if you acknowledge the underlying biology of your emotions. Surviving a traumatic event requires a shift toward a counterintuitive variable: emotional exposure. Researcher Brené Brown spent years conducting grounded theory research on shame resilience and the biological drive for human connection. Her work centers on vulnerability. In a clinical sense, vulnerability means existing in a state of uncertainty, taking relational risks, and deliberately exposing your emotions. Brown found that choosing to be vulnerable and practicing deep self-compassion are biological prerequisites for surviving a crisis. Without honest emotional expression, it is impossible to build the trust required to connect with others when you need them most. Mental strength is the exact opposite of an impenetrable shell. It is the raw courage to remain open, honest, and engaged, despite the very real risk of getting hurt. There is an assumption that the ultimate goal of surviving a crisis is simply getting back to normal, but clinical psychology points to an entirely different trajectory: post-traumatic growth. Baseline resilience is the capacity to adapt to stress and quickly bounce back to your pre-adversity status quo. Post-traumatic growth is different. The event shatters an individual's assumptions. Instead of returning to baseline, they use those fragments to construct a more complex psychological architecture. This creates a fascinating clinical paradox. Highly resilient individuals, those who rapidly bounce back from adversity, may actually be less likely to experience post-traumatic growth. Their foundational worldview is never fractured enough to require a radical reconstruction. Being broken by friction is not a failure of mental endurance. It is the necessary, agonizing starting point for a reconstruction of identity. But this level of transformation cannot happen in a vacuum. The scientific reality is that our capacity to adapt is heavily constrained, or amplified by our environment. Indigenous communities have long operated on a relational worldview. This approach dictates wellness requires balance between the human mind, the physical body, the spiritual realm, and the socio-environmental context. Through practices like storytelling and traditional ecological care, these communities systematically nurture intergenerational resilience. The individual is protected by being embedded within a continuous historical and cultural narrative. Modern sociology refers to this as social capital, the intricate networks of solidarity, mutual trust, and systemic support that actively alleviate the deterioration of mental health during severe crises. You do not have to endure hardship alone. True mental fortitude is an active, vulnerable, and beautifully intertwined collaboration with the world around you.